Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Okay, yeah, so I'm talking about women and the history of Republican theory. So on almost any standard telling of the Republican political story, there are no women bequeathed to us in the sort of canon of names that we're all familiar with, names like Machiavelli, Harrington, Locke, Rousseau, Price. There are many, many more, of course, but these are the sort of names that we've been hearing about. And yet, of course, women did write Republican political philosophy. In many cases, their work deserves to be studied and recognized and integrated into our current body of knowledge, not only as individuals, but collectively as well. They added a distinctive perspective and some conceptual sort of innovations that I think will operate not only as individual thinkers, but women working together. Now, for the most part, the influence and impact of these women's writing has been limited, unjustly so, but I think undeniably. But one philosopher in particular stands out as a genuinely towering figure in the 18th century. She was politically engaged, she was a popular celebrity, she had a formidable reputation on both sides of the Atlantic, on both sides of the English Channel. She was a genuine influence on the American and French revolutions. And she was someone who left an enormous body of writing that's extensively worked out in intricate detail. She also engaged successfully with many of the now sort of canonized male thinkers and philosophers of her time. And she's someone who Edmund Burke, for example, feared as what he described the greatest champion of them all amongst his opponents. I'm talking about Catharine Macaulay. Now, in her day, her prominence is hard to overstate. Her 8-volume History of England was a bestseller, and for a time it eclipsed the sales of her rival, David Hume. He had his own multi-volume history of the same name, and for a little while, Macaulay outsold him. She was a considerable celebrity. There was memorabilia with her face on it, supposedly sold in every corner shop. There were London plays satirizing her, art depicting her, and newspaper articles gossiping about her scandalous private life. And yet, virtually as soon as she died, she was entirely forgotten, pretty much until our own time. And there are several reasons for this, I think. They're not all sexist. Some are sexist. I think there's a refusal to engage with her as a philosopher, or at least there was traditionally, to analyze her seriously, the logic of her system, just to see her for what she can give to feminism rather than actually look at her as a complete philosopher. An unwillingness to see her as a philosopher in context, either as part of a philosophical tradition or in dialogue with others. But there are other reasons too why she might have been forgotten. She was a radical Republican who died in 1791, the height of the chaos and terror in France. Revolutionary views were unpopular, to say the least, and the reputations of a great many figures, men and women, were lost as a result. We might think of, I think, Richard Price, another great hero of mine, and Joseph Priestley. We've been hearing about them both. Theoretically, very, very sort of rich, but now rarely studied, certainly by philosophers. I think with amongst historians, it's different, but other than by Republican philosophers within the discipline of philosophy, they're rarely studied, in my view. Now, as we know, Republican political philosophy fell out of favor for most of the 20th century. Sometimes people say the 19th century as well. My own work looking at abolitionist theory in America sort of traces a great influence of Republican philosophy. But I think certainly the 20th century it fell out of favor, but has risen to prominence in the last 30 years ago, as we've been hearing, as we all know. And as it has done so, Republicans have returned to their sources. And in particular, I think, to the 18th century, obviously not entirely, but that's a particularly rich time. So Price and Priestley, along with Thomas Paine, now have a central place in the reconstructed version of the tradition's history. But Macaulay has been left out. Indeed, as I said at the start, there are no women in the standard telling of the Republican story. I recently reviewed an excellent collection on Republicanism and the future of democracy. It's a volume to which several sort of very historically minded Republican scholars contributed, but there was no mention of a single woman before Hannah Arendt. I think for people in this forum, she's probably not even the right kind of Republican. And so I think this is troubling for a number of reasons. For one thing, Macaulay simply deserves to be recognized. She's easily the equal of Price or Priestley, and in my view, she has a valid claim to be considered the preeminent Republican thinker, male or female, of the 20th century. The 18th century. So more concerning, however, is the fact that republicanism is so often, and I think understandably, regarded as an essentially and thoroughly male-oriented philosophy. Now, that's not my view, and it's not the place to enter into that debate, but that is a perception, and leaving out people like Macaulay contributes to that. But rather than Macaulay being alone or unusual in writing as a Republican, she stands at the head of a sort of remarkable flowering of female-written Republican philosophy. In her time, of her contemporaries, she was a considerable influence on Mary Wollstonecraft, most famously, but also Anna Letitia Barbauld. Into the 19th century, we can see women such as Mary Hayes, Mary Shelley, drawing on this same tradition, and often on Macaulay herself. Across in France, Macaulay was an influence on Madame Roland, on Olympe de Gouges, Sophie de Grouchy, Germaine de Stael, many more. If we look to America, we can think of Frances Wright, Margaret Fuller. In the sort of slave narrative or Black tradition, there's Harriet Jacobs, Anna Julia Cooper, and many, many more. So this was a significant moment in Republican history that seems to have been entirely sort of written out of the overall arc of the story of how this philosophy developed. So much for their background. What I want to do in whatever time remains, I'm remarkably bad as a timekeeper. I was supposed to start my stopwatch at the beginning. I forgot to do that. I've got no idea how long I've been talking for. But what I want to do is focus on Macaulay's analysis of the effects of arbitrary power on social and cultural context, in which any claim for women's citizenship rights or political equality must inevitably be made. Now, while Macaulay is an impeccable historian of Republican history, a philosophical analysis of arbitrary power and social context, as Quentin highlighted yesterday, I think, in his keynote, it is an extension of the legal context in which neo-Roman republicanism arose. But it's very important in its time, and I think it adds a lot to our contemporary perspective of how the internal logic of Republican philosophy should work. In short, without addressing the oppressive social norms in which the law was couched, there could be no freedom for women, or by logical extension, for anyone else at all. Now, liberty, according to Macaulay, is the chief human good, for which she argues we have a natural love. Not only do we love liberty, but it is necessary for several other goods that we have reason to prize. She argues that liberty is necessary for virtue. It is also the bedrock for a safe and stable and prosperous society, one in which all individuals are treated with equal dignity and protection. And liberty is necessary for the progress of scientific, moral, and social knowledge, through which we can build a better society. Now, liberty, as she understands it, is equated with independence, as it is for all Republicans. I personally prefer the term independence to non-domination, but certainly in the context of this talk, it's essentially the same thing. There are differences from how it's often understood today, but I'll leave those aside. Effectively, this is non-domination. I will call it independence. Now, this is not a macho ideal of individual self-reliance. Instead, it is a social ideal through which our mutual interdependence is acknowledged. Through our independence, the rules are established through which no one will be able to take advantage of the very interdependence that we have on one another by unduly exercising any form of asymmetric or arbitrary power over us. Now, of course, there is a clearly sort of macho streak that does run through a lot of Republican writing, particularly in this period, but it's not, in my view, integral to the philosophical system. So I'm going to set aside that sort of macho reliance. Philosophically, it's not actually playing any role. I'm not yet sure whether it was women who initially sort of emphasized the communitarian aspects inherent in the idea of independence, but it's certainly prominent in their writing. And that's another reason, I think, for including women as Republican writers. So independence is a complicated concept, but it also entails two further values: equality and virtue. Equality indicates an equal standing as members of the political community, with equal input into its laws, equal protection under those laws, and equal opportunity within those laws. And virtue, this is often a confusing term. It can be used in various different ways, and its meaning is shifted from Roman times through the Renaissance, many times. But in essence, it comprises two senses that are very closely connected: benevolence and reason. Collectively, members of society must be benevolent to the extent that they are prepared to support the common good rather than to pursue their own private interests where these conflict. And they must be both willing to and capable of following reason. Now, a constant theme in Macaulay's work is that the unconstrained exercise of power corrupts people's virtue. Again, that's not unusual for Republicans. Why this is why equality is such a key concept. There should not be any substantial imbalances of power. The process of corruption happens in both aspects of virtue that I've mentioned, affecting both people's benevolence, their preparedness to support the common good, and their capacity for reason. And reason itself, the capacity for reason, is affected in two ways. At an individual level, people are liable to be easily deceived into believing what is expedient or convenient, and they're likely to deceive themselves where it serves their own interests. At a collective level, false ideas, principles, and values become established in the set of socially accepted ideas that govern our conduct. This is something Macaulay is very sort of emphatic on. They skew our conduct and our debates, and they stifle people's ability to stand back and reflect on their beliefs and enter into impartial, rational debate. So as individual and collective impact, Macaulay develops this argument initially in the context of political power, and in particular with respect to the idea of monarchy. One of her principal targets is the notion of royal prerogative. She was very much sort of opposed to the idea that the glorious revolution, supposedly 1688, was as glorious as I said, because it retained this idea of royal prerogative. She thought that was a wedge through which we could sort of maintain the arbitrary nature of the king's power. This was the ability of the king to effectively bypass the constraining power of Parliament and to act in his own power, thereby circumventing the necessary checks on his personal political power. Now, but her argument is not confined to politics. Macaulay uses the same structure she develops in that political context to apply to the domestic sphere, to the foundations of patriarchy. She does this in a reply to Hobbes early on in her career, 1767, and she completes the argument in her last work, the Letters on Education, 1719. Here, Macaulay uses exactly the same language of prerogative in her rebuttal of Rousseau's arguments concerning what he saw as the natural and inevitable imbalance of power between the sexes. She draws that parallel between the arbitrary power of the monarch, the arbitrary power of the husband. If men want social and political freedom, then they cannot continue to dominate women and keep them dependent, because in granting men prerogative power over women, the virtue of both men and women is corrupted, thereby, she says, sowing confusion and chaos in the system of human affairs. Again, corruption of virtue affects both people's behavior and the background social ideas. And this is again crucial for Macaulay. Men, she says, become arrogant, believing in their superiority. Women become, in her words, coquettes, using sexual power rather than their more rational capabilities. This corruption on both sides spreads. It affects more than just relations between men and women, or between the sort of bilateral case of particular men and women. Certainly, it draws in and infects the whole of social and political life. Even more problematically, however, false ideas about gender roles and women's natural fitness for rational and independent conduct are easily established in the public consciousness. And this is what she argues is exactly what Rousseau propagates. More generally, under conditions of social inequality, the ideas that take hold and are disseminated are those that are to the advantage of the dominant group. In the end, Macaulay concludes, every part of morals becomes fluctuation. Customs, manners, sentiments change according to the notions of those in power. And she concludes, it is from such causes that the notion of sexual difference in the human character has, with very few exceptions, universally prevailed from the earliest times to the pride of one sex and the ignorance and vanity of the other. This has helped to support an opinion which a close observation of nature and a more accurate way of reasoning would clearly disprove. So this sets up a problem that Macaulay herself cannot easily resolve, given the corrupt state of the nation with false and pernicious views, not only of the sexes, but more generally concerning all views about political freedom that are inimical to liberty and equality, what can be done? The dominant, after all, have their ideas lodged in the public consciousness. That skews public debate in their favour. They will not easily let that go. Now, Macaulay herself remains optimistic about the power of natural reason to overcome error and vice. With a system of national education, she argues, that equips and motivates individuals to critically reflect on their beliefs, she is confident that immutable principles will prevail, prejudices will be overcome, and this will pave the way for a more virtuous society.
Alan, I'm sorry for interrupting. You have 5 minutes, about 5 minutes left. Thank
Okay,
you.
I think I only need a couple, just got half a page left. Thank you. Yeah, what I just said there, I think seems unrealistic. Macaulay's optimism, sort of sanguine view of this, I think seems a little bit unrealistic. At this point, Wollstonecraft takes up the argument and moves it on. She builds explicitly on Macaulay's arguments, but in a less sort of sanguine way. She downplays the possibility of reforming society on rational principles alone, especially given the current conflicted starting point from which they start. In every age, Wollstonecraft notes, there has been a stream of popular opinion that has carried all before it, such that whenever people try to challenge it, the truth is lost in a mist of words, knowledge rendered a sounding nothing by the specious prejudices that assume her name. So this is not a good place to start from. Under these circumstances, there's little that education itself can do. Children educated on rational principles, for example, would be turned against their parents, who would still be governed by their former prejudices. This would divide families and society. So her refrain that she mentioned several times in the Vindication of the Rights of Women is that until society be differently constituted, much cannot be expected from education. On her account, then, it is not education that is prior, but social reform. It is not the rational principles that come first, but the cultural medium through which these are inevitably and necessarily filtered. If we are to reason clearly, then the social conditions must be suitable. Now, how that is brought about, that's a separate conversation. I think Wollstonecraft has a very good account of how we might do that. But nevertheless, that's, I think, far too big for such a short talk. But there must not be any dominating power that can influence the social construction of ideas to their own advantage. In other words, it requires an egalitarian society in which all parties can contribute to the creation of the concepts, values, beliefs, and norms through which they will be themselves viewed by others. This is what she famously refers to as the revolution in female manners. She calls for this at the end of the Vindication of the Rights of Women. It's a collaborative venture between men and women to redefine the social, political, and economic relations between the sexes. And only against this background can the equal citizenship and full legal and political rights for women operate. I think I'll stop there. Thanks very much.